makes errors because he never stops lying. He's playing tennis without the net, and his fans love it. Putting your faith in deranged personalities isn't a viable alternative to having truly liberal institutions that you can trust.
I just want to point out that it took Snopes 4 years to address the good people, fine people on both sides lie, where it was supposedly applying to Nazis and white supremacists, where those were the fine people on the other side. It took Snopes 4 years to issue an article about that. But even after Snopes finally issued an article about that, Joe Biden repeated it several times, and then Kamala repeated it as well. So this guy is sitting here telling me, this Sammy Harris guy is telling me that he is trying to uphold truth, honesty, and people who correct themselves when one of the central arguments against Trump during the campaign was that he said that Nazis and white supremacists were fine people.
Oh, it's worse than that. This was the defining reason why Joe Biden chose to run, according to Joe Biden. If you hear when he started running in 2020, he cited this as his, core motivating principle on a lie, right? And we're sitting here talking about Sam, who's honestly, he just can't get anything right about COVID or even his own positions because I'm cursed with fucking remembering. And he just you can just bullet point all the things he gets wrong all the time. There is no way to get him to correct anything. And he'll sit there saying Elon Musk doesn't correct his errors. The rockets are fucking landing. All right? You don't do that without correcting your errors, dude. It's not a podcast, he's running.
Yeah, but he didn't correct, but
you have to remember in Sam's case, if things had turned out differently, he would have been right.
True. I always forget that caveat. It's a very good, strong counterfaction.
It's not as good as the rest of us.
And they can be obliged to earn your trust back when they fail. I understand how satisfying it is to find a new bully to beat up the other bullies who've been making you miserable. But the problem is, this new bully is worse, right? This new bully has no principles. This new bully has no journalistic or academic or scientific conscience to appeal to. Whatever might be wrong with a person like Anthony Fauci or Francis Collins or any of the other doctors who have been demonized right of center for their approach to setting COVID policy, at least they are real doctors and scientists who have some professional scruples and reputations to protect among people who actually know something about medical science. RFK Jr. has none of that. He's just a cowboy.
Okay, you can go after RFK if you want to. That's fine by me. My temperament, I don't have any affinity towards RFK. But the number of actual people who qualify for what he is saying is honorable and laudable were actively censored by the federal fucking government in court.
Oh, no, sir.
Social media.
Sir, no, you don't understand. He has the all-purpose caveat where there's always a 1% of actual doctors that are, and I kid you not, this is his actual explanation, which is given numerous times, that are schizophrenic and will say anything. And he usually quotes the fact that the tobacco industry was able to find PhDs, and therefore, Pierre Corey is schizophrenic because the tobacco industry could find some people to pay. He has this all-purpose caveat. In fact, he did this beautiful little line at the Let's Scream That podcast, which is one of the last ones I heard in detail, where he was basically saying, these doctors that Brett brings in, they don't pass the smell tests, and I talked to actual experts. What does that mean? He means that he holds himself up as the actual final judge of who is the expert. Right? So he is not an expert, yes, but he's the expert of experts. His epistemology is grounded ultimately in his own subjective opinion, but he'll take a lot of words to explain mine.
Yes, exactly. That's always been my problem too, is that how can he judge who the experts are when they are conflicting? There are conflicting opinions among, highly credentialed people, people from Stanford and Oxford, and, the Great Barrington Declaration and everything. How do you decide which experts to believe when they're?
I mean, he had
these are the ones that are whacked.
he had Eric Topol on. And if he had Eric Topol on it, obviously his screening process is not that tight because Eric Topol was just spouting nonsense for absolute months. I don't know who's paying him to say what, but he was basically just, a popular influencer who happened to say shit with medical words occasionally.
Eric Topol, but anyway, we probably should move on, but I find it so funny that he started by saying, none of us have any conflicts of interest, right, Eric? And Topol is like, yeah, we don't have conflicts of interest. Turns out, Topol is running a startup that's funded by Pfizer. This is not about I disagree with you on the grading of your paper. It's like he literally said, point blank, no, I don't have a conflict of interest in talking about vaccines. And his startup that he is a director of, or whatever, he's on the page on the about page of that startup, is literally funded by Pfizer.
He's also Christian Anderson's boss at this Christian.
Oh, there's that minor action. Yes.
That might be a conflict of interest, so to speak.
Well, I mean, it is, especially when you look at the money that Christian Anderson has brought in from the NIAID. So there's a massive conflict of interest there, and Topol did a tremendous amount of damage. And like all of the charlatans that Sam has failed to spot, he did not spot Eric Topol.
I mean, he literally just said, you don't trust these medical experts, where the first half of the podcast was talking about how all these medical experts can't even tell what a woman is at this point.
Well, right, and to the extent that he has some sort of framework in which he's the arbiter of which experts are trustworthy, his algorithm is obvious. And the point is, it's the ones that agree with the institutions. And so, of course, he has no mechanism built into his framework for what you do when the institutions have either lost their mind or been captured by something corrupt, which is, of course, exactly where we are. So, I don't know. I find this sad because it really is a set of assumptions that have failed for which he has no backup plan.
I think the gamble he was making was far more sociological than sort of a truth-seeking endeavor. I don't think he's protecting anything but respectable politics as opposed to really trying to hone in on the truth of things.
To be honest, I think what Brett just said is not Sam's problem. I think it's the entire democratic apparatus's problem. There's a paradigm shift where these people are so used to the top-down epistemology of the experts will tell us, where Sam can afford to pull an exception on the trans issue and say they went crazy there, or he can afford to say I'm not going to take a booster because reasons. But ultimately, he grounds his epistemology on what do the experts say. And if you see everybody who supported Trump, from Brett to Tulsi to J.D. Vance to Elon to all sorts of people, let's take Joe Rogan as a perfect example, right? What is he good at? It's MMA, comedy, and interviewing. All three things are about real-time feedback, adjusting as things go, not about I'm just going to follow the formula and I hope it works out, right? So all of those people just said enough and we're going on the other side. So now they've got a lot of people who know how to make up their own minds. And that doesn't mean they're right? But they kind of know how to start from a question and look around and compose evidence and come up with a position that they can argue without the argument being, well, that's what the CDC said. On the Democrat side, they just don't have a way of doing that at all. Which is why I don't think that it is about the trans issue or the vaccine issue or the censorship issue or whatever. The censorship issue is probably the biggest tell that they just don't want a dialogue because they can't. They have no way of actually facing face to face with any actual pushback. But ultimately, it's a framework problem. To the degree that they don't also become a bottom-up epistemology party, they're going to spend a decade out in the wilderness and probably more until they actually recompose their thinking from the bottom up. And I don't actually see how they can do that. Like, and to that extent, like, trying to attach this to, like, oh, it was the Palestine protests, no, it was the trans issue, or, like, if you hate the Democrats, that's great, because getting distracted with that and saying, like, oh, we should have tweaked our position on this one issue or whatever, is, like, irrelevant to them actually getting back into power. That's my view anyway.
Yeah,
But Sam has the exact same problem. There's no distinction between the Democrats and Sam there, other than that he chooses to object to certain things on a sort of special pleading kind of basis.
Taking shots at the establishment. The Joe Rogan podcast is not a substitute for the Wall Street Journal or the Kennedy School at Harvard. It is simply not progress to have a comedian like Dave Smith, who's apparently done his own research, interviewed about the history of the Middle East or the war in Ukraine like he's the next Henry Kissinger. All of this free access to information is making us dumber. Of course, I blame social media for how divisive our politics have become. Trump is what you get when 51% of a society just declares bankruptcy on core moral values and political principles and journalistic ethics.
If the Democratic Party keeps this up, they will lose. Here's my opinion, saying that everyone who voted for Trump is just abandoning all morals.
I don't know who called it that he was building up to go completely bananas, but I feel like that was a good call.
There's absolutely no justification in any semblance of reason for them to make this decision. Yeah, that'll win him back. That'll win him back, Sam.
And necessary institutions. There is no real defense of Trump and Trumpism. All his defenders act like his critics just don't like the man's style. He's just too crass or bombastic. Or they think we're worried about hypothetical things that might never happen. We're worried he might become a fascist in the future. And needless to say, these concerns are telltale signs of Trump derangement syndrome. But none of that is true. Right? The problem with Trump isn't his style, and it's not merely what might happen in the future. The problem is what has already happened. It's the damage that Trump has already caused to our democracy. And it's the fact that he has turned the Republican Party into a personality cult that celebrates all this damage as a sign of progress. For instance, while many of us really wanted Kamala Harris to win on Tuesday, we are also breathing a sigh of relief that she didn't win by a very narrow margin. Why are we relieved about this? Because Trump and Elon and several other high-profile freaks spread so many lies and conspiracy theories about election fraud that they effectively rigged our society to explode. On the day of the vote, Trump and Elon were both spreading lies about a terrible fraud being perpetrated in Pennsylvania. Now that Trump won, where's the concern about fraud? It just evaporated. I guess Elon looked into it and our voting machines are fine now, right? Pay attention to what happened here. These guys imposed a serious risk of injury on our whole society for purely selfish reasons. And the fact that we're now relieved to have avoided a civil war is itself an injury to our democracy and to our social order.
Okay, I have to object to this. So, one, he's ignoring currently the new theories of how Elon helped Trump steal this election. Granted, they are not coming from the top at this point. But in order for him to have this particular angle and talk about how it's destroying our confidence in elections, we are currently now having the President of the United States and the Vice President of the United States peacefully transfer power to the next Hitler. Like, that is the premise that we have been set up with for this entire election. That
And we're raising them, just FYI, right? It's an asteroid is headed towards the Earth, and the President and the Vice President are just disabling the defenses, and just kind of letting it, waiting it.
they lost the ballot counting competition, and therefore, I guess we just have another Holocaust. That's what happens in a democracy sometimes. The propositions that we are faced with as a society, as deleterious as unwarranted voter fraud claims may be, the idea that this election will end in the slaughter of millions of people or the imprisonment of millions of people unjustly is also deleterious to our functioning society, and he is on board with the side that ran with that as their primary message. That was their closing argument.
He was unhappy that Kamala didn't win, though. I have to just be clear here.
Well, no, he wasn't happy that Kamala didn't win. He wasn't happy that Kamala, didn't win by a slim margin.
No, he says he's relieved that she didn't win by. He wanted her to win, but he's relieved that she didn't win with a small margin. That was his.
Yes. Okay. Sorry.
Incredibly convoluted take. Anyway.
It's too ethereal a point to understand. If someone rigs your house to explode, and the bomb just happens to not go off for reasons that they didn't actually control, it seems to me that they don't get to say, well, no harm, no foul. Let's just move on. Let's agree to disagree on what happened here. No.
In the previous Free Press conversation with Ben Shapiro, he said, "I do not believe Trump is an existential threat." Okay, he retreated from his previous positions that strongly suggested he did, and now he's using another existential type, threat scenario.
No, his retreat position is that he's an existential threat for democracy. That's what he's retreating to. And so, your house is our bureaucracy, right? Anyway. Sorry for playing Bill Manning Sam here, but
with your lies, you knowingly raised the temperature and the pressure on your side of the electorate, again, with lies, and ran the risk of producing serious violence if things had gone the other way. I mean, honestly, there was a moment on Tuesday night when the tide had fully turned against Harris, when the needle over at the New York Times website was giving Trump an 89% probability of winning. But the blue wall states had not been decided. But it was still possible at that point for Harris to win. 1 in 10 chance events happen all the time. But I remember thinking that I hope she doesn't win now. Because at that point, given the optics, given that Republicans really thought they had it in the bag, and that even Democrats seemed to think that, and thought that publicly, in plain view of everyone, on television and social media, if Harris's luck had turned at that point, and she had won, we could have had a civil war. Given the degree to which conspiracy thinking had been weaponized by Trump and his enablers. Again, even on election day itself, these lies had been spread consciously, deliberately. Elon did this personally to hundreds of millions of people on the social media platform that he owns. Given all of that, honestly, I think it simply wasn't safe for Harris to win a free and fair election at that point.
Obviously, I disagree with Sam a whole lot, but here is something I want to specifically hone in on, which was that throughout the day, or at least the 2 days of those voting times, some places like Pennsylvania had a lot of early voting, where throughout the whole week leading up to the election, people were waiting in lines. Some of the news that spread on Twitter/X actually mobilized the GOP's election, legal team to go and try to fight what they were recording and seeing. So if he can't counterbalance the potential, false stories that spread with the ones that actually mattered and got attention to eyes that needed to see it, then he's not even analyzing this from any pretense of being accurate or balanced.
Sam Harris spent a good year or two going full on Russiagate stolen election.
Yeah.
This guy. And he's never cleaned it up, and he's kind of retreated to there was he was happy to accept the help or whatever he's saying now. But he literally interviewed every crazy Russiagator you can find and heard and probably agreed with the craziest theories. And here we are. And by the way, the Democrats went with Russian interference. Again, the FBI was the Russians are whatever interfering with our election on election day or before, like the day before, like right on the time. So, and by the way, I had also made the same statement that if Trump wins, he should. Like, I really hope he wins with the popular vote as well.
I made a very
because we're going to be in trouble.
I made a very similar statement. Yeah.
So what is this? Shame on Trump for making me feel like I didn't want the election to be close. Like, all right, like what?
I don't know the degree to which his mind or the things he says is simply a result of the things he reads, or if he just happens to be in the same exact phase as the other people doing the political analysis on that side. But they all really want to coalesce around the idea that disinformation is the problem that they have to tackle. That is the central thing that they need to solve, because unless they solve that, we are destined to vote for Trump-like people with the same series of poor logic and lies guiding people's decision-making.
So let me just wrap this up in a bundle, just so we really appreciate the point being made. Unless we control the plebs' information intake, our democracy is going to start returning results we don't like. That's the take. And he literally said it. He's like, we have too much information. We have access to too much information. It's making us stupid, or whatever he said. Okay, so who gets the pick, Sam? Is it you?
Somebody important, because nobody important downs elections. Remember he said that? He said nobody important. Was it nobody important, nobody prominent, or something?
I know the quote. He basically said that Elon had torched credibility in the circles that matter. Anyway.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's
right. And I see now. See, Elon's become a social pariah. Nobody wants to talk to him. He's not fielding any calls by nation state leaders or anything. It's really sad what happened to him.
Brett, I saw you hesitating. Do you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, in his failure to clean up his Russiagate position, he brought Rene DiResta back on, and Rene DiResta is one of the Russiagators that he initially interviewed and did not see through and promoted. So he has not only does he have a record that he has to clean up, but that record continues into the present, and he's just continuing on as if nothing happened.
That is a totally crazy thought to have had on election night in America in the year 2024. Where do we send the bill for the damage that has been done to our country? Half of our society just elected a man to the presidency who they know would not have accepted the results of the election had he lost. Vice President Harris conceded the next day, as everyone knew she would. There is probably no one who supported Trump who thinks that he would have done what they fully expected Harris to do, which is to protect the most important norm of our democracy, the very thing that makes it possible, the peaceful transfer of power.
To Hitler.
And the astonishing thing is that Trump supporters are totally okay with this asymmetry. They expected Harris to concede and would have demanded that she do it, and yet they know Trump wouldn't have conceded.
Can I just say, I would be totally happy if she didn't concede. I don't care. Sam is making this novel sort of norms, kind of argument he's been making for a while. There's no law that says you have to do it. It's not in the Constitution. There's whatever. I don't know. He's just oh yeah, he hasn't done this one thing that is just super important. And it's that nobody thought to. It was so important that nobody thought to put it anywhere, and it's just completely just.
When Trump didn't,
whatever
they going back to 2000, Al Gore didn't concede until December. Al Gore launched a lot of court cases, and they counted and recounted Florida for quite a long time. We had this hanging Chads controversy where they were like sort of arbitrarily making the decision about what a ballot was. Depending on who the precinct was run by.
The new GoDaddy
And that was causing a lot of
AI
controversy. So he didn't concede until December when the Supreme Court, issued their final, proclamation about the scenario. So this idea that the person can concede the next day is obviously false. And Trump didn't concede, and many never conceded. And guess what? It also wasn't enough. The concession was irrelevant to that fact.
I mean, I don't really want to get into like everybody being basic or whatever. It's higher at this point, but like, I just find it fascinating that this is clearly like retro constructed thing where this one thing about the concession is now become like the sine qua non. Like I just can absolutely not vote for this person because of this one thing or whatever. And it would have been something. I guess what I'm saying is like it would have been something else. If it wasn't this, it would have been something else. But somehow this now becomes the argument about like, oh, he didn't do this one thing. So basically, I guess maybe a way to sort of make my point a little bit more coherent is that in other things he'll say like trust the institutions, right? In this thing, well, we have institutions like the way this gets resolved. There's a procedure, there's a court, there's a whatever, and that's how it goes. Okay. Well, you don't trust this institution because it might not return what you
Well,
left.
the guy might have said, no, I don't want to leave. And how do you solve a problem like the guy not leaving the building?
It's a threat to our democracy.
Yeah.
He lost, understanding all the risk this would have posed to our social fabric, and they are fine with that. That is already the ruination of our politics. That is what the path to fascism looks like. We are already on it. There is nothing hypothetical about this. Bad things have already happened. And this is true whatever happens over the next 4 years. It's like in the film, The Exorcist. If your kid has stigmata and is vomiting green goo in all directions and is moving furniture with her mind, you should admit that you have a problem. It shouldn't require Satan himself to make an appearance. What is so frustrating about Trump supporters is that they refuse to acknowledge any of this. They simply refuse to acknowledge how pathological our situation is and how pathological Trump himself has made it. Whatever story you have in your
By
head
the way,
about all the
this is entirely made up, right? This is whole. They entirely refuse to admit the yada yada yada. And if your child is, this is completely made up, wish casting, mind reading, whatever. Like, I can find you, like, I don't know, thousands of people who are like, yeah, I don't love Trump, but yeah, no, this is a problem. But like, I mean, probably more Trump voters that would say that than that they would say no, he's great. It's literally he's just like soloing on facts that aren't real.
I'm still scraping my brain right now to try to figure out how we can cohere this dire warning that he's issuing right here, that fascism is already on the march into the White House, with the idea that we should also honor the peaceful transfer. Now look, I'm not a pure utilitarian, but this asshole is. The way he framed himself, and I'm not aware of a utilitarian who says we should just peacefully transfer power to the violent fascist.
Oh, he has said, in fact, I think it was in the trigonometry. Why do I know this stuff at this level? This is really concerning me. In that trigonometry podcast, he said, democracy is not a suicide pact.
Apparently it is. I mean, the way that he's saying this right now, I mean, he also just said something that's, largely incoherent, which is that it doesn't even matter what happens in the second term. Like, nothing has to happen that's actually fascistic and scary and the worst that we can imagine, but it's, whatever happens is still fascistic in nature. Like, that's completely incoherent. But still, the premise is that we have made a grave mistake collectively to some degree, and that collective grave mistake is about to just be handed over the keys peacefully, because that's sort of the game we play with our entire existence.
Can I just note that Sam wrote a column in 2003, I believe, for the Huffington Post called "In Defense of Torture," meaning that sometimes you have to do something really awful if something sufficiently important is on the other side of it. And I disagree with that for reasons I'm not going to get into now because it's going to be a long conversation. But
that sounds like someone who is talking about the utility of an act.
Yes, exactly. Yes, that's exactly what he's talking about. And so here, he's like, well, my one principle has been violated, yada, yada. But he doesn't actually do any calculus whatsoever, saying like, all right, but what did we get? There is some damage to our institutions or whatever, but what are we getting in return? Like, there's none of that. It's like, well, there's nothing we can get in return, basically, that will fix this. It's kind of this play between utilitarian when I want to get over your moral objections, but the ontologist when my moral objections are at play.
His moral landscape starts to look more and more like early 3D video games where you randomly walk into a wall and fall through it, where it looks like things are designed from maybe a distance, but once you get up close, it doesn't make any sense as far as just geometry goes.
Yeah. This is anyway, whatever.
Good. What do in a second term? He's a disruptor. He's got all the tech bros in there with him. He's just crazy enough to scare our enemies. But he's just a bullshitter. He won't do half of what he claims he'll do, so don't worry about it. Whatever story you're telling yourself, here's what is true now. We are returning a man to the Oval Office who is a sitting president, but not fitted to a peaceful transfer of power. And he tried to steal the 2020 election, all the while claiming it was being stolen from him. And he has lied about this ever since, knowing that these lies stand as a continuous provocation to violence. And there are court cases pending seeking to hold him accountable for all this. Cases which, now that he'll be in control of the Justice Department, will be dismissed.
He was never held to account for anything to do with the transition of power. Just saying.
When we know that he can't honestly discharge his oath of office because he has no respect for the Constitution, and half of our society is not only willing to run this risk, they are positively jubilant about it. At a minimum, you should acknowledge that these events have seriously injured our politics. Again, whatever happens over the next 4 years. I have something that I really must say to Joe Rogan and the other podcasters who interviewed Trump. You can't have it both ways. You don't get to say that this was the podcast election and that these long-form conversations are incredibly important for people to hear so that they can make up their mind about who to vote for, and then take no journalistic responsibility whatsoever to get your facts straight or to expose obvious lies when you're talking to the most prolific liar on earth.
60 Minutes just released an interview a couple weeks ago with Kamala Harris where they edited and interspliced answers to different questions and juxtaposed them with questions they didn't belong to. What on earth is he even trying to put on a podcaster for editorial control when 60 Minutes has that controversy still looming where they won't actually release the transcripts to prove exactly what questions were asked and what was answered?
I don't know, dude. Like, this is just so fucking. I have nothing to say to that here. It's just making shit up at this point. There's no. Like, it takes 5 minutes to search for this stuff. It's not. Look, I get on some level he's not plugged in, right? He doesn't know this stuff because he has not been exposed to it because, I don't know, too much information is making us dumb or whatever, so he's smart by not knowing. I don't know, something. But, like, I don't know. Like, I mean, this is exactly that thing, right? Where, okay, so what journalistic responsibility are you taking for just free and saying stuff? And, there's no way to correct you. And you're just mouthing off like stuff that we can, like, basically point out here it's false. But like, okay, sure, whatever.
How long was your excerpt? The infamous one. What was it?
2 minutes 20 seconds.
2 minutes and 20 seconds, because that was what Twitter allowed you to upload at the time.
I think so.
2 minutes and 20 seconds is an exceptionally long context frame, and he wanted to cry afterwards that you took him out of context, even though you were, I think you linked the full thing for people to listen to. He placed
It was a thread full of other clips from the same interview.
he placed on you some sort of a burden where now you have to somehow create a context that is like 15 minutes long in order for his masturbation to make sense the way that he imagined it made sense. 2 minutes is not long enough, but he's willing to quote Trump at 5 words and say that that's enough context. He gets my goat.
You don't get to spout endless conspiracy theories about how our election system is dangerously broken and vulnerable to fraud. And then when your candidate wins, say, oh, well, Trump's victory was just too big for them to rig the election. No. How about realizing that there was nothing significantly wrong with our election system in the first place, and that all these concerns about fraud were lies coming from your candidate and his surrogates?
I would say that the ability to have rumors completely derail trust in your election system is a flaw in your election system.
Exactly, yeah.
Guys, the Democrats they were the ones that started the whole voting machine thing. Like, and by the way, they are correct, right? Like, we are technologists. We know how technology works. We know that what is happening right now with these, with the way that this voting system works is absolutely insane. If you ran a startup that for some reason actually cared about getting election results correct, and you had a chief architect that showed up and said, this is the system we're going to build, you would fire them immediately. This is not I'm not making a partisan point here. It is a ridiculous system.
Any junior, poli-sci major talking about voting and elections and confidence would tell you that there's two competing, sorts of requirements for a voting system: anonymity and then, veracity, where, the person should not be identifiable connected to a particular vote, but they should also somehow have confidence that their vote was counted. And let me tell you, we might have decent track on the anonymity part, but the second part is it's a black box. The entire election across the country is a black box. Most people do not know how their vote is counted or how they can be assured that their vote got counted. That applies across the spectrum.
Of course. But can I also just say, he went after Dave Smith, who I really like, and he was like, he's Kissinger, and he goes on about the history of the Middle East.